The material we're in is the part of our course is what I'm going to call Metaphysics, even though the title of the book from which this emerges is called Physics. So first let me give you a little bit of history of this word metaphysics. Originally, all it really meant was, the books that, among the books that Aristotle wrote, the book that that later scholars called the Metaphysics, was the one that came right after the physics, right? So it's like Physics Part 2, or Son of Physics, or something like that. But all it was originally meant was this is the book, big book, the Metaphysics, that comes right after the one that you just read part of, the physics. So there wasn't anything real fancy that's meant by metaphysics. But in the course of time, it came to mean something like, different people would suggest different things. One, something beyond physics or deeper than physics. I think the way I put it to you at the beginning of the quarter when I tried to talk about, I mentioned that Thales and some of those other folks were doing metaphysics. What I tried to suggest was that metaphysics has to do with some of the sort of presuppositions that are shared by people who do physics, chemistry, and some of the other natural sciences. Now, that's not as good a definition as I'd like to give, so I've been thinking a little bit about that. It's tough to distinguish. That's why I think the problem comes in. It's tough to distinguish sort of controversial questions in physics on the one hand and metaphysics on the other. Now, the way I'd like to leave it, metaphysics is something that it may be that people who work in theoretical quantum mechanics are dealing with, because there's a lot of controversy there. Now, since I have defined, for the purposes of this course, since I've defined philosophy as just trying to deal with questions that don't yet have clear-cut answers, I think the best way to regard the word metaphysics is this. It refers to the attempt to understand the philosophical questions, or not just philosophical questions having to do with the world, often philosophical questions that remain even within the sciences. Metaphysical questions will include whether there are, and this isn't a particularly scientific, or won't sound like a scientific question to you, but metaphysical questions will include such things as whether there is a God or not, or whether there are gods or not, because it has to do, among other things, with what there is out there. Now, science doesn't really, in spite of what people say, science, I think, doesn't really pronounce one way or another on whether there are gods or not, although sometimes people think that science says that there aren't any. I'm confident that if you talk to enough scientists, you'll find that they don't believe that, or not many of them believe that, or maybe 50% of them believe that, but it's not a universal belief among scientists that science pronounces either way on religious questions. Most of our sciences don't address them, but it remains a metaphysical question, whether there are gods or not. It also remains a metaphysical question whether there are entities called quarks or not. At least I believe it remains a metaphysical question, but that's a metaphysical question that really only physicists or people who are acquainted with state-of-the-art physics are best suited to discuss. The question is basically this. I don't know if you're familiar with quark theory, but there's a way of talking about subatomic phenomena that involves reference to sort of super subatomic thingies called quarks. Leptons, I think, are also a category of things that are at that same sort of level. And the idea is that with this, there's so many subatomic particles now that if we think of the world as made up first and foremost of quarks and leptons, there's a relatively small number of them that we can specify, and putting them together in the right combinations will give us all those somewhat larger subatomic particles. So it would be explanatorily convenient. It would be a nice explanation to sort of look at things in terms of these quarks. but they're plainly not the sort of thing that anybody can observe directly. And indirect observations of quarks have been rare, and I think still controversial. The I think makes all the difference. If by now physicists are all agreed that there are such things as quarks, that they're not just explanatory conveniences, well then I guess they're no longer philosophical issues, at least among physicists. They're no longer metaphysical issues. But on the assumption that they're still arguing about these things, and maybe to some extent about black holes, although the evidence is getting better and better for the existence of black holes, those remain metaphysical questions on my definition. So once again, I'm suggesting to you that metaphysics is just the kind of philosophical part of the study of the world, and what there is in the world, how it works, how things interact, which things are most basic, questions like that. So even in this book here, The Physics, the issues are primarily metaphysical, because that's what they're dealing with. Deepest one in this section that's excerpted here, The Physics is a much longer book than what you got. The deepest one is this question about substance. Now let's go through this, because again, I want to try and, if you have your books, this would be a useful time to look at them, because I'd really like you to sort of, I would like to find out from more of you than just a few folks who were talking here a minute ago. I'd like to find out what is extractable on first reading, even in that first page or two. I mean, look at these sections. They're helpful. The first section is called The Difference Between Natural and Artificial Objects. A good question to ask yourself after you get through this extremely difficult section is, what is Aristotle saying that the difference is? I want to try to go to somebody else. What is Aristotle saying makes the difference between natural and artificial objects to start with? Yes?
Is when things happen, like water, fire, natural things that happen. And artificial is when someone makes it happen. So natural would be something that happens with water and fire.
I think you may have it. It's not the way Aristotle puts it. What do you mean when you say that natural is when things happen? Give an example, if you can.
A natural thing happening could be
Okay, well, what makes that natural, according to what Aristotle says in the book? He sums it up. There is a line buried in the middle of here. Yeah?
Isn't it something about the unnatural things are a result of a craft or of...
You're on all around the outside of the central thought. What makes, let me put it this way. What is it that distinguishes the natural? You're right, they're not products of a craft. There's a curious example, if this helps any, it may not help at all. On the next page, there's an example about a bed. If you bury a bed, Aristotle says, you won't get it. That's not a good way of making another bed. Right? To bury a bed, you won't get another bed, but you might get more wood. You might get a tree. It might be that there's seeds in this, still some seeds in this bed, and it will sprout, and conceivably you can get another tree. Now, what does this prove about the natural and the unnatural, or the natural and the artificial? Okay, Brian.
Natural has an origin of change and stability.
Say it louder.
Natural things have an origin of change and stability.
Have an origin of change and stability. Okay, a simpler way of putting that is that natural objects have some innate tendency to change in certain ways, to grow, to decay. I mean, even if the wood, the chair, I'm sorry, it's a bed that we buried, isn't it? It's not a chair. Even if the buried bed doesn't sprout and become a tree and produce more wood, as wood, it will decay. It doesn't do this insofar as it's a bed. I mean, you put a metal bed in there, it'll go through a different sorts of processes. If you put some, plastic bed, it'll take a lot longer. If it's not, biodegradable. But eventually, when the sun, or when the Earth crashes into the sun, even the plastic bed will go. One hopes. But the main idea is that it's not its bedness. It's not the fact that it's a bed or a chair or a dresser or some particular artifact that has any kind of tendency in it to change. It's its woodiness or its metalness. It's the stuff it's made out of, which is the natural part of it, its natural aspect. It's not really a part. It's not like a part is like a nut and washer. Those are two different parts. Or the handle is a part of the dresser, or the arm is the part of a chair, the headrest is the part of a bed. Wood isn't really part in that way of the bed. It's an aspect of it, right? And so it's due to its woodiness that the bed has any tendency to change when we bury it in the ground, to decay or whatever else it does. And that's the sign of the natural. So the material stuff out of which the bed's made, and he lists the sort of normal elements of which that presumably is comprised: earth, air, fire, and water. That's what Aristotle thought were the natural elements. Those things are natural. So are, and these are additions. These are additions here. According to Aristotle, he lists at the very beginning animals and their parts, plants, and then earth, fire, air, and water. He lists those separately, interestingly enough. But the key to something's being natural is that it has some kind of innate, internal, I guess that's the way. Innate makes it sound like these things are born. Maybe that's not something we should worry about right now. But it has some sort of internal, natural tendency to change. Artificial objects don't. You have to change them. You make them. You create them. Or they are created. Let's put it that way. Now, what this leads up to is his discussion of substance, which is what I really wanted to get to. A good old-fashioned traditional definition, owing a good deal to Aristotle, of the word substance is this. Anything whose existence or subsistence, that means continuance, is independent of other things. Substance is anything whose existence or subsistence is independent of other things. Let me give you an easy example. Colors exist in some way, but there's no such independent thing as the color blue. At least not that exists. You can get blue things. But blue, it might be said, isn't something that exists in its own right. So it's not a substance. Its existence, whatever, we kind of exists. We know all about it. Here it is now. Its existence is dependent upon the existence of stuff like pants and shirts and whatever else might be blue. And then those we'd have to inquire further about which, what part of them is their substance, what aspect of them is their substance. Another interesting example, this is what I'll leave you with because we'll probably, I won't deal with it now, we'll deal with it later in the quarter, is a more contemporary issue. Is mind, for example, a substance? For generations, people, including Plato and Aristotle, as you notice in his little list of things that are natural anyway, Plato and from them on, probably long before them, there's an idea that there is such a thing as a mind, a spirit, or a soul inside of us. We saw this mind, spirit, or soul discussed in the Meno. This idea that the mind is an independent substance is one that's come under considerable attack in the 20th century. It's not like nobody believes it. Probably more people than not, if you were just to count heads, more people than not probably still believe that mind or spirit or something like that is independent of the body. More people probably still believe that than not, but it's been under a great deal of attack in the present century. You're aware that there is a doctrine that's widespread, especially among people who are fans of science, that all there is a very complex physical, chemical arrangement. That's all there is. There's no driver in the driver's seat. We are just big, complicated machines. The main thing I want to get at here is that's an issue about, at least the Greeks would describe it, as an issue about which substances there are. Is mind a substance or not? Is it something that exists independently of the body, or is it something, I mean, because we're aware of what people refer to as mind, we certainly feel it, we know it, maybe it is completely reducible to physics and chemistry. Maybe it's completely dependent upon the physical body. If so, if it doesn't have an independent existence, that would be saying that mind is not a substance in its own right. Does anyone remember what Aristotle's position is on the question, what is a substance? Or what has substance? There is actually a section here on page 241 which answers the question. And as usual, I mean, in reading these things, look for clues to what's going on in the section titles, in the section headings. Yeah. Okay, you're doing the whole thing, but I mean what the section title says is whatever has a nature is a substance. Substances are things that have a nature. And in the previous discussion, up at the top of the page, we learned which sorts of things have a nature. Those are things that have an innate tendency to change in some way, innate tendency to decay, to grow, to mold, to rust, all the things that are obedient to the laws of nature. Now, once again, this may be confusing. I mean, you'd be quite reasonable in saying, but everything is obedient to the laws of nature, isn't it? I mean, how does that distinguish between chairs and anything else, or beds? Well, that's once again where the passage on the next page, 242, comes in handy. What he suggests is that burying a bed is not a way to get new beds. What happens when you bury a bed is it will rot, or if there are seeds that are still in that wood, maybe some of the seeds will sprout and you'll get trees. You won't get beds. You'll get new trees. So that the bed appears to have, in one sense, has an innate tendency to change, but it's just insofar as it's made of wood. I mean, it's because it's made of wood that it has that tendency to change, not because it's a bed. If you'd buried a wooden dresser or a wooden desk, the same thing would happen. You wouldn't get desks, dressers, and beds. You'd just get more wood, or you'd get, more likely, just a whole pile of rotten stuff. And if these objects were made of metal, they'd rust. They'd decay. So it's insofar as something is wood, that's the extent to which it's natural. I mean, insofar as something has an innate tendency to change, that's the extent to which it has a nature, and that's the extent to which it's a substance. So if you want to know what's the substance in the bed, it's going to be this, whatever it is, that has an innate tendency to change. Not the bedliness, not the form. Okay, now the reason for going through this in detail is just mainly to show you how to read this stuff. And I'm hoping that not just for Aristotle, but for the future people that you have to read, you'll attend to the section headings, because they're usually not put there by the original authors, but by later people, the translators or the editors or somebody who's trying to help us sort through what's going on. So look at the section heading. And then if, for example, you see something like whatever has a nature is a substance in the section heading, that's not enough. I mean, that's kind of the bottom line. You should be trying to figure out what in that paragraph would lead anybody to believe that, because all that is an announcement that in the following paragraph I'm going to argue that whatever nature has a substance. And so you should be looking for something like reasoning, reasons why one might think that. Now, I want to get to something that I think is a little bit more important than Aristotle's position on substance that's also in that reading assignment. This has a lot of interesting value in considerations about the development of science, in the philosophy of science, the understanding of scientific method, what science is up to, and what inquiry is up to in general. This has got a lot of interest to epistemology. So the stuff on substance was basically metaphysics, and now we're going to go back a little bit to epistemology, which was what? Study of knowledge. Okay, so we're going to be looking at that for the rest of this period. It's the stuff on page 245 of your text, the stuff about causes, the four causes. I want to talk about that not only because it's important, but because I think this way of putting things might seem a little bit peculiar to you. Does anybody have any remarks or comments to make, or even questions about that particular differentiation between four different causes? I mean, I'll say right up front that what I think might be confusing is the fact that there's only one of these four causes that most of us would call a cause. Look them over, those of you who have textbooks. Which one really looks like something that we would call, in modern English, a cause? Do that. Look them over while I'm jotting the four of them down here so I can point at stuff. I like to point at stuff. There's the material cause. The next one is the formal cause. This is the efficient cause. And that leaves the final cause. Let's make sure that this is up as far as it goes. It's not. Okay, that gives us more room. The four causes. And I'll even put that in quotes because, as I say, I think that word's used in a kind of a unique way. Brian? The fourth one, the final cause. Does anyone have another suggestion? When we say that something causes something else, is it the final cause that we usually have in mind? Final cause is defined as the end, what something's for, if you like, the purpose. I'm going to put the word telos there. That's a Greek word that we will return to in a couple of weeks for other reasons. It's a word that means end or goal. Sometimes it refers to purpose. There's other things that can be used to indicate. I'm going to put the word function here also, because when you're talking about what something's for, that's sometimes what you have in mind. You're talking about what its function is. Okay. Well, the answer to the question, it seems to me, is no. I mean, when we say that something causes something, we're usually not talking about its function or its end product or its goal or what it's designed to produce. Or not, Brian?
Well, I think it is because it answered, well, actually all four of them answer the question why.
All four of them do answer questions why, and you've put your finger exactly on what it is that Aristotle's really trying to sort out. He says these are the four ways in which why questions might be answered. Now, I don't know if I see why, I'm not sure that there couldn't be other ones. I mean, I'm not going to push too hard on this contention that these are the only four ways in which why questions can be answered, but they are at least four ways. And so up here, let me clarify what Aristotle's trying to do in listing these four causes by saying that these are, parentheses, four modes of explanation. If what we want to do is to explain something, we might have any one of these four things in mind, or more than one. I mean, it doesn't have to be just one of them. But if somebody wants an explanation of something, I'll even venture to say that Aristotle's right that it's usually the case that it's one of these things that people want. And we'll have to clarify what those are. The answer to my earliest question, though, in talking about the word cause as it's used in modern English, it seems to me that the efficient cause is the one that captures what we usually mean when we talk about causes. So let me go to that one. The efficient cause of something is whatever brings it about. Now, in the case of an object, it's the origin of that object. It's whatever happened that made that object come into existence. In the case of an event, it will be whichever events brought this new event about. So when we ask, what caused that? In English, I think usually what we mean is we need to describe we're asking about the efficient cause. What brought it about? The final cause isn't whatever brings it about, it's whatever it's for. Whatever its end is, whatever its goal is, whatever its purpose is, whatever its function is. I mean to lump all those things together when I say the final cause asks what a thing is for, what a thing or an event is for. Usually, I think we wouldn't call those causes, but that's the word that Aristotle used. He used the same word for all of them, and that's the way it continues to be translated. Material cause, what's that? If you know, let me know. If not, look down at the book. Somebody other than Brian? You guys are all relying on Brian for this. Yeah?
It's composition.
Yeah, it's whatever, and I'm going to try and put this in the same kind of structure so that, I'm not going to just put on its composition. I'm going to say, when we ask about the material cause, we're asking what it's made of. So whatever it's made or composed of. And then the formal cause might be a little vaguer, but I don't know. Someone who hasn't offered a suggestion yet, please. What's the formal cause? what does it say? It says the form, the pattern, is a cause. The form is the account of essence and the genera of the accounts and the parts that are in the account. I think I see why you're not leaping forward with a suggestion. That's difficult to understand. What do you make of that? Yeah.
Maybe like sort of like its shape, like a hole exists because it's round.
It's not bad. It's not. The shape isn't quite it. I think you're first of all going from the word form, but what do you? He says it's something like, that is the pattern.
How it's made.
It's not how it's made, because that's more like the efficient cause. The efficient cause refers to the origin of a thing and how it comes to be, although there's some ambiguities there. Yeah, another try? Yes?
Like maybe whatever causes it to come about,
Okay, it's hard to do this with the word cause staring you in the face, because one wants to talk about what brings it about, how it is made. Forget the word cause. Well, we're asking for a formal cause, according to Aristotle. We're asking for the kind of thing it is. What kind or category of thing it is. Now, let's say, I mean, depending on the situation you're in, you may need this information. I mean, you may need all of it. Something might be so ununderstood, I mean, so unclear at a particular moment that you won't have any of this information. You'll have to make inquiries into all of it. But let's just pretend that we're trying to explain something, and let's say we're in a situation where there's something vague in the mist out there, and we can't quite make it out, but sometimes, as you know, when that happens, you're looking at things and you're staring at things, and all of a sudden, it finally, falls into place. You see what it is. I mean, maybe a figure, a person moves out of the mist, and you see that it's that, or you think it's a person for a second, but then you see, no, it's a mailbox. I mean, I don't know what examples to use, but you surely have had experiences like that where something is vague and you don't know quite what it is, and then suddenly you see, aha, it's a person, or aha, it's a mailbox, or it's a store, or it's a cat, or it's a werewolf, or whatever it happens is that emerges out of the mist. Once you are clear on what it is, what kind of thing it is, that provides you with something of an explanation. I mean, you know how to fit it into your understanding. And so that's what we get when we suddenly, for whatever reason, it might be that we have to do a scientific investigation. We might have to do to dissect a particular animal to find out what it is. I mean, a mysterious new species that we hadn't seen before, we want to know, well, which genus does it belong to? And that's a good example for Aristotle, because he was a biologist himself. But we might have to do all kinds of experiments, observations, and then finally, aha, now we see, because of this evidence, now we know what kind of thing it is. It's a mammal or whatever. I mean, I don't know. But when we find out the category or kind that a thing belongs to, we have answered a certain kind of explanatory question. Aristotle calls them why questions. I prefer just to talk about them as explanatory questions. When we want to explain something, there are these four sorts of information that we might need to help us understand it. Before I get to you, Brian, I wanted to emphasize this. Now, what the biological sciences up until the present century really emphasized such stuff as categories, taxonomies, what species does this belong to, what genus does that belong to. That's a very, very important thing in biology. All the sciences are very interested in efficient causes, trying to figure out not only what brings about particular events, but what are the laws that affect causes and effects. You find a law-like relationship such that whenever you do this, you get this effect. That's a discovery. And you can now explain, well, why did this happen? Well, it's because there's a law that says that whenever you do this, that, and the other thing, you get this effect. That's an inquiry into efficient causes, and physics especially has been extremely adept at giving us efficient information about the efficient causes of things. And also physics has been important in working out the material causes of things, trying to figure out how things are made, the atomic theory of matter, and below that modern quantum mechanics. And then beyond that, a theory I mentioned, I think, the other day, quark theory. These are all efforts to dig into the compositions of things, the very basic compositions of things. And those are efforts to answer questions about material cause, as Aristotle would put it. Now, the final cause, traditionally, and with Aristotle, was something that was equally relevant in all areas of inquiry. Nothing has no point. It was sort of incomprehensible that things could possibly exist with no purpose, no end. And for a long, long time, that was the dominant view about nature itself. Must have a purpose, must have a point. And so we try and figure out what that purpose or what that point is, and we're investigating the final cause of things. More recently, purpose or point has not been the real thing sought by teleological investigations. Instead, we try to find the function of things, the function of the biological parts. If we're looking inside an animal and we see some sort of gland that we don't understand, I mean, if we're biologists or something like that, we want to know, well, what does it do? I mean, how does it function in the larger whole? And in studies, more modern studies of ecologies, we investigate not just particular glands and not just particular animals even, but we want to know what an entire animal species, how it relates, how it functions in its larger ecological niche. And what are the interactions between this species of animal and this kind of plant? And what happens when this plant starts becoming scarce, then that affects the population of several kinds of animals. And then that has another effect on other things. And when you're looking at the role that parts play in larger wholes, you're asking questions that are more or less functional. And I think they fall properly into the category of questions about final cause. Okay, Brian, back to you.
I'm having a hard time differentiating between efficient cause and final cause, because take an example, if lifting weights is used to fulfill the desire of getting fit, well, wouldn't the desire of getting fit bring about lifting weights?
Well, it does in the sense of, but it's not, yes, it does. And I think that you're thinking like Aristotle did. That's good. But notice that lifting weights is the efficient cause of getting fit, while getting fit is the final cause of lifting weights. But you're right to see that the relationship works like that. I mean, to say it in English, once again, lifting weights is what brings about the fitness. And fitness is the goal, end, or purpose for which one lifts weights. So that's how those are related. Okay, any questions about this? Yep.
Would the material cause apply to actions as well as just objects? I mean, how would you...
I think so. Aristotle seems to talk about these things, and I mean, part of the problem with reading Aristotle is he's got about 18 different levels of abstraction, possible ways of looking at things, and he sorts them out quickly before your very eyes, and it's hard to see exactly how it all falls together. I mean, and then that has left commenters on Aristotle lots of work to do, trying to figure out what he really meant from that day to this. So don't feel like the Lone Ranger if that's not clear to you from reading it. But I do think he means to say that anything at all, insofar as it can be thought to have a composition, like an event might have a beginning and an end, I think he means to say that anything at all might very well have have a composition and therefore be subjected to questions about material cause. Much easier, though, to apply that to objects, to the physical world. I mean, it's easy to see that things have compositions and that we can do an analysis of that composition. And that interest, as I say, I'd say that these two interests here have been dominant historically in physics. And it's because physics is so good at doing that stuff, at establishing both the material cause and the efficient causes of things, that it's been so beneficial to us. I'm guessing that even in physics, what future progress will require is more and more attention not to individual isolated things, but to things in environments, to things already in certain areas of physics. It's not only acknowledged but insisted upon that there is no clear-cut distinction between the thing observed and the observer, especially in areas where you're talking about really, really, really tiny things. When you're talking about electrons, there's no way to investigate an electron without interacting with it. As a matter of fact, there's no way to investigate anything without interacting with it. Like, to look at this pen requires that I place it in an environment where light is shining down on it. That means, light is interacting with it. But the pen is, massive enough that the interaction of light with it is insignificant. When you get down to the level of the electron, I mean, you've got to bounce something off it to observe it. You have to interact with it some way. Observation is a kind of interaction. But electrons, respond massively if you were to try to bombard them with photons. Photons are bigger. So you shine light on an electron, you'll knock it out of the picture. So a better alternative, but still not much better, is to try and examine it with an electron microscope. What you do with an electron microscope is you bombard things with electrons, but that's still like shooting a cue ball at the 8-ball, right? You're bombarding an electron with an electron. So you can't observe something even without interfering with it. And so how you decide which is the object of observation and which is the instrument is something that's, not entirely arbitrary, but it's something that you have to decide. You have to figure out, how am I going to investigate these things? So I think more and more, especially at that level, but probably even in the larger levels of physics, more attention will have to be given to functioning systems. Systems analysis of larger wholes, not just individual particles of the kind that motivated Newtonian physics. The idea of individual particles traveling independently through some complete vacuous medium and then interacting finally with some other similarly independent particle. I mean, that's not a realistic picture, and I think physics has already parted company with that kind of analysis. Any other questions, comments about this? Now, what this does, again, I want to place you once again in the milieu that Aristotle wrote. You remember that not too long before, there were all these different investigators, Thales and Anaximander and Protagoras and Heraclitus and Parmenides, and that whole crowd of people that I listed to you early in the quarter, just having monumentally different things to say about the physical world. I mean, they couldn't be more opposite than saying, as Heraclitus did, that the only thing that's real is change. And then on the other hand, saying, as Parmenides did, that change is absolutely impossible. I mean, you don't get much different than that, or much more different than that in two different theories.
You say change is possible in motion?
Change is not possible either. Zeno, his student, I think we may have emphasized some of the things that Zeno argued. Zeno focused his attention on the impossibility of motion, but for Parmenides, all change is impossible. The only thing that can be real is this sort of single, unchanging, timeless one. One what, you might well ask? Well, it's just one. And this was for logical reasons. It wasn't just some mystical thesis. He thought he had good logical reasons for establishing that. But I mean, you can't get any further apart than some of these pre-Socratics. So that was the world in which Socrates did his inquiring, trying to search for some truth, with apparently a faith that there is some truth. And that seems to be, this is a matter of some controversy among classical scholars, and I'm no classical scholar myself, but if I had to pinpoint, how does Socrates, how is he to be distinguished from the Sophists? There are two things. One, the Sophists seemed to think that there were answers, although they were all local, relative answers. There were answers to questions. Socrates professed not to know anything, professed not to be able to teach any knowledge anyway, whereas because the standards of the Sophists were lower, they were prepared to call knowledge whatever somebody believed. They seemed to be also prepared to say they could teach. But more importantly, it's in this apparent belief of Socrates that there really was some answer to be sought to these questions. That it wasn't enough just to offer an individual's beliefs. In fact, individual beliefs don't much matter. What a person believes or what a society believes is only important if it can withstand the kind of criticism that he sort of leveled. And his life was, in one way, a disappointing one because he never, nothing ever withstood that challenge. At least that's what he says in the Apology. Plato, with the same faith, now based partially upon the work in mathematics of the Pythagoreans, but based on the same faith that there really is some knowledge to be sought, there is some truth, objective truth, he formulates big, huge doctrines that purport to be the truth. Doctrines about knowledge, doctrines about the world, doctrines about what's real and what's not, doctrines about politics. So he claims to be able to reach conclusions about some of the objective truths out there that were the things that Socrates sought but never found. And then Plato's student Aristotle more or less looks at this whole tradition. You notice that he's talking about Democritus and Empedocles and Anaxagoras. He's talking about a lot of these people that we've mentioned and many others as well. He kind of gives us some of the only information we have about some of these folks. I think he's trying to say, let's put some order in all of this. Before, I mean, I'm not sure he was able to take his own advice always, but I think his idea is that before we come to conclusions about what the answers to these questions are, let's just get a little bit clearer about the right methods to use. And I think his sorting out of the four ways in which we might offer explanations for things, I think that's part of his effort to get clear on what we might call scientific method. Saying here are these four kinds of questions that are reasonable to ask. The theorist of nature, the person interested in the study of nature, really ought to try and get answers to all four of these types of questions. Shouldn't be satisfied with just having satisfied questions about the material cause. I mean, it's not enough just to say water is the basis of everything. That's very interesting, but that doesn't tell us how water can produce everything else. And we need to know that too. We need to know the efficient causes. We need to know what the array of different sorts of things really is in the world. And then finally, we got to put it all in perspective and see, well, how does it, what's the whole point? What's the point of all of this? What's it all for? How does it function in tandem with other things? And if we make balanced inquiry into all of these four areas, then I think he had some faith that there'd be progress in science, progress in understanding the world, progress in understanding anything that we turned our attention to.